The South African economy is facing a deep contraction due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as effects which could be felt by neighboring SADC countries as well. Now, there are many pressures on the rand, including concerns about governments ballooning debt, the impact of the coronavirus, and load shedding on an already weak economy. 3 million fewer people were also employed in April, according to a recent survey. And this week, the National Assembly agreed to the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill. This allows the Treasury to reprioritize expenditure items in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, with the Monetary Policy Committee of the SA Reserve Bank scheduled to meet again this week to review the interest rates, we're going to discuss the economic overview for the week and also the forecast for the week ahead with PESA Executive Director Sia Biniza. Sia, very good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here on Newsroom Africa so bright and early. I should probably wish you happy Nelson Mandela Day for that matter. But let's just kick things off by looking at the SADC region. I mean, just looking at how COVID-19 perhaps has impacted the inter-trade relations, the frameworks that have been put in place, also honing in on that growing Islamic State threat that is currently happening in Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado province. Walk us through what that impact is ultimately going to have on the SADC region economically.
Thanks. That region really is taking quite a knock, and obviously South Africa being the worst affected and accounting for almost half or just over half of the GDP in the region, the echo of the economic impact from South Africa is going to spread out to the entire region. And we recently published our quarterly PESA Regional Integration Monitor that looks at the impact of COVID from multiple dynamics, growth, public finances, etc. So what we're expecting to see is obviously the growth impact is going to have a negative shock throughout the region. We're expecting an average growth in the SADC region to decline to 3%. South Africa as a country is expecting a decline between 6 to about 10%, depending on which projection you're looking at. Obviously, a lot of the impact is still unfolding, given that South Africa is still facing rising infections, and I don't think that we've reached our peak as yet. And then if you look at the impact of that on government finances as governments try to recover or support livelihoods and businesses in their country, this is pushing governments to spend at a time when government revenue is not actually growing, at a time when the economies are in a pretty much standstill. And so what we're expecting is a rising deficit throughout the region. South Africa's deficit is projected to rise anywhere between 14 to about 18% of GDP, and that is the worst affected, followed by the Seychelles, which is just after South Africa. But as a region, the expectation is that the average fiscal gap, which is the gap between government spending and government revenue, is going to rise from what was 4.4% last year, 4.4% of GDP, to 9.2% this year. And so you can see that this impact is not just constraints in the economy, it's also spreading in terms of government finances as well as the balance of payments, given that there's also no trade happening at the same time. And so really it's going to have quite a severe impact. And there's some growth shoots, such as what's happening in Mozambique with the investment in mega natural gas projects. But even those now are facing new severe challenges that the region has never faced in the form of ISIL terrorism, which is unlike what we faced in other parts of the region. If you think of the ongoing conflicts that's happening in the east of the DRC, which have now sort of been normalized in many ways, this is actually quite a new threat and targeted directly at the investments that are taking place in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. So the picture really is of a largely destabilized region as a result of the epidemic, but also because of the limited healthcare capacity, we still have to see how that is going to impact public health generally. But currently, what we're seeing is quite a severe impact on the economies, a severe impact on trade, and that's passing through in terms of government and also balance of payments in the region.
Now, see, I just want to hone in a little bit closer to home. I'm looking at that revenue amendment bill that had been passed by Parliament this week. I mean, ultimately, reprioritizing expenditure. What is the impact going to have on South Africa?
So I think initially when the pandemic hit and government released its economic recovery plan, there was a lot of optimism among South Africans that, government being quite proactive and has taken measures that are required given the impact of the pandemic on the economy. But the implementation has been slightly different from what has been promised, as we've seen with the slow take-up on government funding that has been provided, whether that be through the government guarantee or whether that be through the small business development grant system and also even direct grants through the social development department. The uptake in the actual progress has been quite slow. And so the expectation is that firstly, government was expected to add an additional 170 billion in new spending to support businesses and livelihoods. But this is formed part of a broader package of government, which also includes around 130 billion in reprioritized spending. Some of that going towards public health, which is much needed given the lack of personal protective equipment, etc. And a lot of that going towards supporting businesses, whether that be through the 200 billion government guarantee scheme, which is provided in conjunction with the Reserve Bank and the private banking sector in South Africa, and some of that going towards supporting further implementation at a local government and provincial level, and as I mentioned, public healthcare spending towards fighting the pandemic. The impact is expected, as mentioned, to widen the government deficit, which is the gap between government revenue and spending, by to up to 15% of GDP. That's quite significant, and we haven't seen that level of a deficit in a long time. However, fortunately, there are different views as to how government will finance this. Fortunately, we have a lot of opportunities. The National Treasury has promised that it needs to borrow around $7 billion from international financing institutions such as the IMF, and already they've received $1 billion each from the the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, so far. However, there are opportunities locally, given that quite early on in the pandemic, the Reserve Bank has provided liquidity to the local capital market to the tune of around 500 billion rand. However, this also happens at a time when government coffers are having difficulty servicing some of this debt, and that has led us to being downgraded to junk status. And so there are different views as to, is this sustainable? Can government afford to borrow further, given that we've been downgraded, which raises the cost of borrowing? But my views definitely are that there is opportunity to borrow domestically, and I don't understand the pressure to borrow from international markets, given that the South African rand has been depreciating, but also, more importantly, that a lot of the spending is going to go towards social welfare support and social spending generally, rather than economic investment, which will create a return to refinance that international borrowing.
See, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. I do know that the Monetary Policy Committee of the SA Reserve Banks, in fact, also set to meet this week. Just in one line, do you think we can expect further interest rate cuts? Can this help to further reprieve the already dire economic situation? What are your thoughts?
I definitely think that the Reserve Bank will have that mandate in head. Given its mandate on inflation, I'm not sure that it is in a room to make that decision quite outright. However, if you look at growth, we're expecting a much greater shock now in the second quarter than we felt in the first quarter, which does create perhaps an argument, but I'm not sure that will sit within the mandate of the Reserve Bank. And so at this point, I'm uncertain whether this will mean a cut or not.
All right, PESA Executive Director Biniza, thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn.